RMC is supported by MonsterJoysticks.com. Level up your retro gaming with their joysticks featuring genuine Sanwa arcade parts. And OneClickPrint.com for your photos on canvas, acrylic, gifts and more. Local craftsmen and global delivery. Joining us for tea today on our biscuit-sized journey of discovery into the birth and development of video games is programmer, writer, artist, composer, comedian and father of Leisure Suit Larry. It's Al Lowe. Welcome, Al.
Who, me?
Al, we've heard lots on this series so far about the British version of events when it comes to breaking into the video games industry in the 80s, so I'm very keen to get a US perspective. Where did it start for you? Where did it all begin for you?
I went to a conference of educational computing, what was it called? Computer using educators. Mm-hmm. And I saw the state of educational software at that time and said, hell, I can do better than that. And literally went home, bought a graphics package for my Apple II, and wrote 2 games while I was fully employed full-time as a teacher, administrator. We took those out and sold them. We went to the last Apple Fest, rented a 10 by 10 foot booth, and every publisher that was there, which was basically everybody in the business then, came by and said, oh, this is great, let us publish it for you. That was all it took. That was that easy.
Well, you've skipped over quite a big chunk, I think, which is probably learning how to program. How did you go about doing that?
Well, everybody knows how to do that. That's nothing.
Okay. And what was the software that you first created? Were you aiming for the educational market specifically?
Oh, yeah. My wife and I were both educators. We both have master's degrees in music education. And so she coordinated vocal music for a school district. I coordinated the instrumental music. We shared an office and drove 2 cars to work and home because we both were spending every day out in the field with teachers. So our background is in education. So when our son got to be 3 or 4 years old and the Apple II came out, I convinced her that we should waste a lot of money and buy an Apple II Plus, which was the latest, hottest thing on the market, and that somehow I would make it pay for itself. Sure. I didn't envision how exactly that would be, but it worked out.
Yeah. And the choice of the Apple II, was it a no-brainer? Did you just choose the Apple II because of the size of the market?
Market? What are you talking about? Nobody knew anything about markets. I was a school teacher. I did not immediately choose the Apple II. Instead, because I'm a conservative type, I borrowed all the computers that I could find from the school district on weekends and vacations. I borrowed a Commodore PET and a VIC-20 and here's a piece of history. You can all go to Wikipedia, children, and look up the Sol 20 by Processor Technology. That was a flash-in-the-pan computer company that went into business and went out of business maybe the same day. I don't know, very quickly. And one of the local businessmen who was just like the very first guy trying to put computers into offices and so forth, he bought several of them. Well, he was stuck with them when they went out of business, so he donated them to the school district. The school district had no idea what to do with them. There was no software for them or anything. It was literally a machine that had 0K of RAM. And no disk drive. It ran off off a cassette tape. So you would hook up a cassette tape recorder to it and press play on the tape recorder, and you could play back a tape that had ones and zeros, embedded in it. It sounded like a modem. That was how primitive things were back then. Yeah, I wrote in 3 months. I wrote 3 games. While I was working full time. So that tells you the complexity of the product. But you got to understand, at that time, there were no educational games. There was educational software, but it was very rudimentary. It was the sort of thing it would put a 2 up in big letters and then a plus sign and then a 1, and then the cursor would move down here and flash, and then you were supposed to type a 3. That was the level of software. So for me to do an actual game, a little mini adventure game that used only the space bar and the enter key, or a joystick — we had a joystick interface too — and to teach children directions and just decoding words and so forth, and remembering maps, those sorts of things. It was pretty revolutionary, and we were the first games that were also educational.
So how did you come to secure the deal with Sierra? Was this at a trade show, or did you contact them?
We spent a lot of money. I mean, for 2 school teachers, we spent a flock of money and rented a 10 by 10 foot booth at the last Apple Fest. And every publisher in the business came by and said, "Oh, you don't want to publish games, you want to create more games, and let us do the stupid work. We'll do the boxing and packaging and selling and distribution and so forth, and you just make more games." Well, that was what I wanted to do anyway. I was a creative type, and I wanted to do all that, so that was fine for me. So it was a choice of the decision was to choose which publisher to go with, as opposed to find a publisher. It was a different time. Mm-hmm. So I produced games for ourselves. Then they bought the rights to the games, and I was still teaching full time. So when the summer came, Ken convinced me that I should go full time and work for him. And I thought, well, that seems good. I've got this guaranteed job at the school with the school where I can never be fired. And I'll make good money the rest of my life. Why don't I just piss all that away and take a job in this new industry that has no proven track record that I don't even know anything about? So that's what I did. And 6 months later, he fired me.
This is Ken Williams, as in Ken Williams, co-founder of Sierra.
My good friend, Ken Williams.
And he fired you 6 months later.
Well, you got to understand, that was the Christmas of Atari E.T. E.T. came out. Every kid wanted a copy of that game, and it sucked. So it ended up being a brutal Christmas for all the other publishers, because every mother bought E.T. And all the rest of us had product returned. So that spring, Ken got truckloads of returned games. I don't know if you understand the publishing business back then, but it was modeled after the book business, where if something doesn't sell, they can send it back and get credit for it. And so that's what they did. They sent back all the games Sierra published that Christmas. And let's see, to give you a sense of proportion, when I started in the summer of '83, I was about the 20th employee at Sierra. When 6 months later they ran out of money and all those games came back, and times got tough, they had 120 employees. So there was one Friday morning when the company went from 120 employees to 40. And Ken took all of us programmers and designers aside and said, well, I'd like you to work as an outside contractor. I said, why is that? What's the difference? And he said, well, if you are on the books as an employee, you cost me money. You hurt the bottom line. But if you are working as an independent contractor and I give you advances against future royalties, you become a prepaid asset, and I can move you over to the other side of the books. And I said, well, that doesn't make any sense. And he said, yep, that's right. And I said, oh, okay, so how much are we talking about? Well, it turned out when we were all said and done, it was about twice as much money as I was making as an employee. So I said, well, okay, that sounds fine. Have I just been fired? And he said, yep. And I said, okay, great, thanks. And for the next 15 years, I was an outside contractor with Sierra. I would work on a game and take advances against future royalties. And bet that my stuff would sell. And if it didn't, I wouldn't make any money. But if it did, I made a bunch of money. So
Sure.
it was good. We were both happy, and it turned out to be a good relationship for both of us.
How did the development work itself? Was there some kind of development team who worked on, say, the core engine? You're laughing. I think I may know the answer already. Was there a team that worked on the core engine and then other teams that worked on creating the adventure games themselves?
Yes, exactly. That you're exactly right. There was a team that developed the first King's Quest, and Ken was smart enough to get IBM to pay for it. That was the best decision he ever made. Was IBM said, we want a game that can't be played on the Apple II. We want to bring out this computer that's got 16 colors, and the Apple's only got 4. And we want to make it unplayable on the Apple II. But, you have to buy one of our computers in order to play this game. And so Roberta came up with King's Quest, and the development team got together behind locked doors, which none of us had ever seen before. It was like they had pass codes they had to type in order to get into the room, and it was all hush hush secret because they had these machines that weren't released to the public yet from IBM. Anyway, they did it, and at the opening of the new computer from IBM, King's Quest was the game that was featured. Ken was smart enough to work the deal with IBM that said, if we do all this for you, you have the game, you have the rights to the game, but we want to do for future translations, and we want to keep the code to the engine. We want to own the engine. And IBM said, yeah, sure, whatever. Doesn't matter. It's just a damn game. Nobody knows anything. So yeah, that's what happened. They ended up the company saved the code, the engineering, and it became the basis for the whole profitability of Sierra for the next 10 years.
Yeah. And that engine must have been the AGI, the Adventure Game Interpreter, and then I think later it was the SCI, Sierra's Creative Interpreter. Is that correct?
Yeah. And so that you don't get too highfalutin a picture of us, AGI was merely a bunch of subroutines that were kind of all packaged together, and they had a few strict rules that you had to follow or the game would crash. In fact, it crashed so hard that I restored my hard disk 5 times in 1 week. They installed a bug that ate DOS, and that was a horrible week for me. But back then, you got to remember, everything was on a 5 1/4 inch floppy. So I would bring out this stack of 5 1/4 inch floppies and try and restore my whole project and my hard drive and the operating system, everything. So it was a mess. And when we wanted to improve it, there were a few things that we thought should be changed. We needed access to CD-ROM drives, we needed access to more colors, and we needed more pixels, a higher resolution screen. So the guys who were developing the engine said, oh, that's all you want? Well, we could do that easily, but instead, let's throw out everything and instead change from a C-type procedural language to an object-oriented language, because that's the future. Everybody knows that. They were reading Dr. Dobbs' journal, and they got all excited about doing object-oriented. Well, none of us programmers knew anything at all about object-oriented programming. So instead of a simple upgrade that would give us more features, we got instead a whole new world that just it changed everything. It was better. I agree, it was better. But oh my God, the learning curve was, it was like that, I guess. It was a cliff. But eventually we figured out what to do, and we got some games made.
Yeah, well, one of those games was Leisure Suit Larry, moving on from the seriousness of Police Quest 1. Well, actually, before we move on, one question I've got for you on Police Quest is, were you responsible for having to walk around the car to make sure their wheels don't fall off when you drive away?
if you think that game was persnickety when it shipped, you should have seen it when I got to the project. Jim Walls was a California State Highway Patrol officer, and he was a good storyteller. He would entertain you over a beer anytime. But as far as a game designer, he had no experience at all. So he wrote a story, and then the programmer who was on the team, who was on the project, there was no team. It was Jim and a programmer. The programmer programmed that story. So when I got to the game, I said, "Well, how do we play this?" I started doing it. Everything that I did, I died. And it was Jim. You got to give people some clues. You have to give them some idea. Well, they should know this. So it'll be in the book. So I mean, he was expecting you to learn the police code and the manual before you played the game.
Okay, so you actually made it easier for us. We should probably be thanking you for that.
You tried your best, but I think I failed.
So, Leisure Suit Larry, was it difficult to persuade Sierra to let you make a game based on a middle-aged man trying to get laid?
Oh, well, no, because that was biographical. No, actually, not at all. I'm happily married and have been for 50 years. But I was a jazz musician, and I played a lot of clubs and a lot of bar dates and stuff. And I watched guys operate, and I knew enough about it to know that it was a source of humor. When we talked about doing that project, the game originally was a serious game in which you were seriously trying to get laid. And I said, is this because between the time it was written and the time when we did the remake for Larry, by the way, the original game wasn't Larry. It had no protagonist whatsoever. It had no graphics. It had no sound. It had nothing but text, just plain text. And the literal goal of the game was to get laid 3 times. So between the time that it came out, and was a huge hit, by the way, when Time Magazine started their first column on home computers, soft porn was the featured article, and it was a huge hit at a time when Apple had sold 100,000 Apple IIs. Ken had sold 25,000 copies of soft porn, and everybody I knew had a pirated version. So it was on just about 100% of the machines at that period. So this huge hit that then got out of date when the AIDS crisis came along. Suddenly, open sex and stuff was scary. I don't know how old you were in the late 80s, but every man I knew, well, everybody, not just men, every man and woman I knew were afraid of AIDS because nobody understood it, nobody knew what caused it, where it came from, or anything. So a game like that seemed ridiculous, and so I said to Ken, the only way I could update this game and use the modern AGI interpreter would be to make fun of it. And I think I could make fun of it. I think I could do something as a parody. And because the company was so short of money, Ken's attitude was, sure, try it, see what happens. It's not going to cost me anything. He worked a deal with me that said, if you take lots of royalties, I'll pay you no advances. So he was covered. It didn't cost him anything. I went home and worked my ass off for I think 3 months it took me to write that game. And when we were done, we field tested it. And as far as I know, you can verify this however you want, but this was the spring of '87. We were the first computer game that had beta testers. We actually went on the CompuServe Gamers Forum and asked people if they would like to play a game for free in exchange for telling us all the things that were wrong with it. And for about a month, I beta tested the game. And as far as I know, I've said this for 30 years now, that it was the first beta tested game, and nobody's ever argued with me. So nobody's cited an earlier action. So anyway, that was the way it went. When the game shipped, it was the worst selling product in the history of Sierra. At a time when Sierra normally sold 50,000 copies of a product, Larry sold 4,000 copies. So I figured, well, I just wasted, 4 or 5 months of my life. I'd better get on something else. Well, Police Quest was in trouble, and they said, "Do you want to work on Police Quest?" I go, "Yeah, sure. I'll do anything. Whatever you want me to do, I'll do it." So I immediately jumped over to the Police Quest team, and I didn't follow the game sales, but each month Larry's sales doubled, and until at the end of a year. It was on the soft sell top 10 list with a bullet. It had been out for 52 weeks or something, and it was a rising star. But it was that because it was strictly word of mouth. We invented viral marketing. We just didn't know it. Nobody told us that that's what it was. We also invented shareware with that game because it was so widely pirated that still to this day, when I meet somebody and they say, "Oh, you wrote Leisure Suit Larry?" Yeah, I go, "Yeah, did you pay for it?" And they always say, "I think I paid for some of the later ones."
Larry would become a very successful series, selling, well, I read it sold 1.6 million units by 1996. Is that correct?
No one knows how many copies it sold because while I have spreadsheets that show exactly how many copies of Larry 1 AGI for the PC and for the Tandy and for the Atari and the Commodore Amiga and all these other machines, all those added together, it also then was reissued in literally dozens of combinations of compilations. It was also issued as magazine covers. It was ported to so many different things and so many different computers. And not only by Sierra, also by other companies, Brasoft in Brazil, and I can't remember the name of the company in Italy, that because we didn't do all the language translations, they would just license the game to what's one we didn't do? Japanese. They would license somebody, they would do a Japanese translation, it would sell thousands of copies, but I never got any notice of that. So it's really difficult to say exactly how many copies the game has sold. I just say it sold millions because I know that's safe. I know that we sold well over 1 million copies on the PC, and I know that it sold lots more in other media.
When did you finish at Sierra?
Sierra went through some terrible times. At one point, when Ken Williams was still running the company, Sierra sold 28 cents of every dollar spent on home software. They had a 28% market share by dollar volume for home computer software. It's an amazing number. I mean, Microsoft had 2% back then. Electronic Arts had 15 or something. It was a very segmented market, and Sierra was quite successful. The company was the victim of a hostile takeover by criminals. And I can say that because, without fear of being sued, because the United States government a few years later went after them and convicted them, sent them to penitentiary, where I hope they spend the rest of their life breaking big rocks into little rocks. But there were the guys who took the company away, literally stole it under false pretenses, under fraud. They were convicted of fraud. And it was a really ugly story. So the company that Ken and Roberta started on their kitchen table with no money and just literally just an idea for a game that could be sold through the mail. Turned into a company that was worth over $1 billion in market capitalization. And within 4 years of that hostile takeover, the company had dwindled from 1,200 employees to about 10. And the last people locked the doors and turned off the lights here. And that was the end of a company that really was spectacular in its rise and incredibly sad in its fall. But I'm fortunate. I feel fortunate. I mean, I was there in the 80s and the 90s when the company really was something and was an exciting place to work. And it was interesting because we didn't have very good feedback back then. There was no internet to speak of, at least none that we knew of. And so we didn't hear from gamers. We would put games out and we would get back sales numbers. And if they liked it, well, they would buy copies. And that was our feedback. So we tended to make the games for each other. My biggest audience was Ken and Roberta and Scott Murphy and Jim Walls and those guys, Mark Crow, those guys, my friends. And so I figured, if they like it, probably other people will like it too, which of course turned out to be the end. And really, it was a special place. By doing something that we loved doing, we made millions of people happy, and we made a little money along with it, and that was really fun.
Well, thank you. I certainly count myself among one of those millions who you made happy. So thank you for all of the work that you put into your games.
You paid for the game?
I did. On the Commodore Amiga, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Al, and take care.
Okay.
If you enjoy my content and would like to toss a coin into the hat to support the cave, then check out patreon.com/retromancave and join the official cave dwellers you can see on the screen now. Thank you for your support.